Welcome and thank you all for standing by. At this time, all participants are on a listen-only mode until the Q&A portion of today's call. By that time, to ask a question, please press star followed by the number 1 on your phone, and please record your name when prompted. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. May I introduce your speaker for today, Ms. Jan Zorner? Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, operator, and good day, everyone. Welcome to Schneider Electric's Innovation Talk Series. Today is Tuesday, May 5th, and I want to wish everyone a happy Cinco de Mayo. We thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. We hope you are well and appreciate you staying connected with us. I'm Jennifer Zorner, Director of Sales Enablement for Schneider Electric, and I'll be facilitating this session today. And I have just a few programming notes to get us started. Today's topic is microgrids, BESS, and UPS peak shaving. As data centers consistently strive to meet high operational demands with sustainable solutions, microgrids in varying sizes and capacities are being utilized as an effective solution. This session will explore how microgrids not only offer backup for the grid in case of emergencies and contingencies, but can also cut costs. And I am excited to be joined today by Mark Hurley and Karsten Baumann, Solution Architects for Schneider Electric, and they're going to walk us through this very timely topic. If you have any questions, we encourage you to submit those through the Q&A tab. It should be on the right-hand side of your console as we go through the presentation, and then we will open it up to answer questions at the end. And if you have any technical issues or anything like that, you can certainly use the chat to connect with me, and I'll help to the best of my ability. So with that, thank you, Mark and Karsten, for being here. And Karsten, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. Yeah, happy Cinco de Mayo, everybody. I hope everybody's safe out there in the world working from home. So let's just dive into this 45-minute journey into microgrids and the energy storage systems and the way we can do peak shaving, utilizing UPSs and energy storage systems. But let me start with, our industry, the electrical industry, the utilities are facing, a very disruptive changes, which are currently already underway, and they will continue in the future. Beyond everything we've seen in the last 100 years. So where in the past, it was a very centralized model, and now we actually start seeing changing this. So one of the dilemmas we're in here is that we know that the energy consumption will almost double here in the next, 20 to 30 years. And at the same time, we all understand there's so much talk about becoming more sustainable and reducing our carbon emissions. So we want to have this. So when we think about, we want to double the energy needed, and then we want to reduce the carbon emissions by 2. So therefore, we have this kind of 3x, where we have to become more efficient, and this is becoming really challenging. And one way to look at this is, the world is becoming more electrified. So energy is not only fossil fuels, but it's also electricity. And so, one little thing I mentioned, so I was visiting a friend in Quebec in Canada a while back, and so I realized that in their residential settings, all of their baseboard heaters is electricity. And I was thinking, really, I was surprised because, why would you use electricity for heating? And of course, in Quebec and Canada, with cheap hydropower, it makes more sense to heat a house with electricity versus burning fossil fuels. So this is just one example as to how, an electric world, is helping us to also reduce some of these carbon emissions. When we look at the new energy landscape, what we call it, and I just mentioned, for 100 years, the electrical system was a very much centralized generation assets. We see this here on the lower left, and then, it gets transmitted, distributed, and retailed, and then there was a consumer. And for many of us, this is still true today. So as the off-taker, we are the consumer of the energy that is being generated somewhere else. And so now what we believe is, where we have these 3 Ds, we call them. Number one is digitize, Devices will continue to be more connected. We're living in this digital entity world, having this IoT-enabled devices where electricity is literally becoming digitized, and we can take advantage of that. We also want to become more decarbonized. So as I just mentioned earlier, not only do we want to become more energy efficient, but we also want to, take advantage of renewable energies such as wind, solar, and other means. And then, we're becoming more decentralized, which we see on the lower right, where now we still continue to have centralized generation from utility companies and its transmission lines, but now we see the change is actually happening both in front of the meter as well as behind the meter. And what I mean in front of the meter is on the distribution side, we see large solar and wind farms coming online. So now the generation of energy is no longer centralized, but it becomes more distributed, and that creates new challenges. And then behind the meters on the lower left, that's what we now call in this new energy landscape, it's the prosumer. At times, we as the off-taker, we consume the energy which is coming from our utility companies, and at other times, we're also producing energy. So it's the combination of consuming when it makes sense and producing when it makes sense. And we want to talk a little bit more about this in the next coming slides. One of the things that actually really accelerating this kind of new energy landscape is that we are at cost parity, and in certain geographical regions, we are even better off in self-generating at a lower cost compared to how we can acquire and purchase the energy from the utility company. So when we think about this, if I have the ability to produce energy at a lower rate than what is available from the utility company, wouldn't it make sense so they actually take advantage of it and facilitate this? So with the cheaper solar and natural gas, everything is changing. So for example, in Northern America, wind and solar will outpace the fossil fuel generation, here in the near future, where more and more renewable energy resources becoming available, and it helps us to facilitate all of this. The prosumers, the ones where we consume and we produce at the same time, it gives us the ability to become also more resilient. When I look at the middle graph here, so this is a typical super high level single line where, we're grid tied to the grid, we have the ability, and specifically when we talk about data centers where we normally have diesel backup generators, if something happens to the utility power on the grid side, we're islanding ourselves and start the generators. Hopefully we have a UPS in between to kind of carry us through. But now you see that we have these new assets like battery energy storage systems, including the energy that is stored next to the UPS, solar, wind, and then we, of course, we have all the loads. When we look at on the left-hand side, why would we even concern ourselves with doing this? So we're trying to solve these for three different kind of things. I already mentioned cost, right? So if it's cheaper at certain times to generate our own electricity, so that's, gives us a more predictable energy cost, so we can have an arbitrage between the energy and the fuel sources we have available. And it gives us flexibility in terms of driving savings and, creating incremental revenue. But then, one of the key parameters in many operations, certainly in data centers as well, is about the reliability and the resiliency. There's a difference. Reliability is, how likely is something to fail, and resiliency in a nutshell is if something fails or something happens, how do we react to this? So we want to solve for greater resiliency to serve the loads at all the time, regardless of the instability of the grid, which is also being facilitated by bringing more renewable intermittent resources such as wind and solar onto the power system. And so therefore, we want to protect the power in a sensitive way and our critical assets, from these poor power quality. And then I believe more and more companies these days are looking for sustainability, as many organizations have now sustainability as key performance indicators in their operations. And as a result, we want to reduce carbon footprint. We want to improve our brand image, and attract, service carbon-sensitive customers, who are really looking now, okay, if I go to company A or B, which of those is more sustainable? And that's what we want to do. On the right-hand side, you just see one of those snowflake charts, where we control all the different loads and generation assets, and gives us real-time view into how we're going to manage this. When we look at the different types of microgrids, we typically refer to like 3 different kinds. On the left-hand side, which is probably where we operate most of the time, these are grid-tied. Very simple example here, if we have a solar system on our roof at home, it's grid-tied, and, if we produce more energy than we consume, we actually feed it back into the grid, and our meter runs backwards. And, by the end of the month, we look at the net metering, and then whatever we have consumed, we have to pay for it. So it's kind of in grid-tied operation. And then from mission-critical applications, we understand the island mode. So when we disconnect ourselves from the grid, and then in the past, this typically has happened when the utility power, the quality of the power was not within a tolerable window. We detected this, and then we started off the generators, and UPS carried us through. So therefore, we were able to island ourselves in this operation, but we purely did it because of the utility power quality, not because of financial metrics or for other sustainability aspects. So this is the island mode, so where we have the ability to island ourselves off the grid, and then at certain points, come back on the grid. And then in certain instances, we also have, microgrid applications which are totally off-grid, so there's no connectivity whatsoever to the utility company, and therefore we are solely responsible for managing our loads and our generation assets in order to provide the electricity and the power necessary to sustain our operations. When we look at a microgrid and ask ourselves, so what is a microgrid? We already spoke a little bit about it. But here on the lower right, we see our load, and this could be any kind of building, including data centers or a factory or residential homes, and then typically we are connected to the utility company. And then here we have this kind of control element and this energy control system where now all the distributed energy resources are being connected to, and this is including the utility. It is including perhaps existing diesel backup generators. It might be wind, it might be solar, it might be fuel cells, it might be combined heat and power plants or combined cooling and heating plants. So all these different assets, we are now able to control, going back to what I said earlier about cost, sustainability, and resiliency. So it allows us to kind of like make these wise choices when to self-generate, when to buy from the utility, at what point. And now you can imagine this is no longer a very static or simple operation. It requires the understanding about weather forecasting, and we'll talk about this in a little bit here. So when we look at why data centers should consider themselves with a microgrid, and I think there's a few compelling reasons, right? So first and foremost, it's the consumed energy cost. We all understand that buying the electricity from the utility company will just continue to go up. So electricity from the utility is becoming more and more expensive, and at the same time, on-site generation, is actually becoming less expensive. So we're creating kind of like this difference, and therefore having a predictable energy cost, will help us in that. And then when we look at our utility bill, and it varies by different operations, we have typically 50% of the utility bill is the actually energy, the kilowatt hours we have consumed. And the other 50% are these peaks. So this is kilowatts needed at a certain period of time. Utility measures our peaks at a 15-minute interval, and whenever we set a high peak, the utility company needs to provide the service to us, whether we need it or not, and therefore we have these peak demand charges. If we can somehow lower the peak demand, and Mark will talk about this more in detail, what options we have here, we can actually save costs and, and create some financial benefits. And then, of course, from a data center perspective and many other operations, we always concern ourselves with reliability and the resiliency. How do we react to it? So we want to make sure that our energy procured or produced is kind of secure and, is always available when needed. And then, of course, going back to the corporate social responsibility, where organizations and customers are helping us to drive new ways of thinking in terms of implementing these kind of new renewable energy resources. Now, on one hand, we have an opportunity, but at the same time, there are still some challenges, specifically as it relates to data centers. And first of all, there's a space consideration. So when you think about to generate 1 megawatt of solar power, you need about 4 to 5 acres of land. So data centers is a very electro-intense operation. And when we look at our rooftop and our parking lots, we may not even have enough space available to actually generate the power we need to provide the electricity for our operation. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to generate or self-generate everything, because in this, as I mentioned, grid-tied operation, we can buy certain assets from the utility. We can self-generate some of ours. But there's still constraints in terms of the space which is available. And then if we are in some areas, I mentioned Quebec earlier, Texas or others, so where the energy cost is very low, it may not make sense, to actually implement on-site generation, because it is, from a financial perspective, less expensive to buy it from the utility company versus doing it ourselves. We all understand from a data center perspective, we are in the business to avoid any kind of risk of failure, because we have our service level agreements, and we have to make sure that our customers are being served with the data and compute power needed. So therefore, we are traditionally kind of risk adverse, and we want to understand that. So this is certainly something to consider. And then in many co-location facilities, the energy cost we have is just simply passed on to the clients, and then therefore, we are less concerned about, the actual cost of energy. Although, if we have means of doing it for less, then of course it can also create an opportunity and create some advantage here. And then in many data center operations, including like the hyperscalers, the Apples, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Switches and whatever, so where they say, we are to a certain percentage, some of them, to 100% green. That means they're buying power purchase agreements, let's say from a utility wind farm somewhere, and then the entire energy they're consuming, they can actually buy these credits, these green carbon credits, and therefore, they have the ability to call themselves, sustainable, which is in a certain way is true, but it doesn't require in that case or rely on any kind of on-site generation. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Mark.
Thank you, Karsten. So when we talk about these microgrid solutions, one of the things we want to share is a new offer where we can utilize a UPS system combined with lithium-ion batteries to allow peak shaving and demand response. This is a new feature. Just requires a simple software update on the UPS system, and it'll allow you to use the batteries on these UPS systems to provide some peak shaving capability. So, Karsten, if you go to the next slide. So when we talk about peak shaving, there's two ways to do peak shaving. You can do peak shaving with a battery energy storage solution that is independent of the batteries that are tied to the UPS, or today with this new offer, you can utilize the batteries on the UPS system to do some peak shaving. Now, being in the data center world, my first thought would be, hey, I don't want to use my batteries in my UPS system. That is there to back me up in case there's a power outage and I need that ride through time until my generator comes online. But the way we have the control software system set up, oftentimes you have excess battery capacity. So if you operate a 2N UPS system, most UPS systems are going to be 50% loaded. If you designed it to have 10 minutes of battery runtime, you actually have 20 minutes if they're both 50% loaded. So you've already got the cost of the UPS, you already got this investment in the batteries, and you have excess capacity. If you're lightly loaded, you may even have more than 20 minutes of battery runtime. And the way the software works is it will allow you to use the excess capacity on those UPS batteries, but it will never drain them below what your minimum required runtime is. Typically, in the co-location industry, it may be 5 minutes. In the financial world, they're pretty risk averse. They may have 10-minute or 15-minute battery runtime. So you've already got this sunk cost and this capital investment that's not being utilized. And today, lithium-ion batteries with the the number of cycles that they can run through, they're not susceptible to the wear and tear like a VRLA battery system. They're ideally suited for this solution. And the other advantage is, when you're doing peak shaving, that's great. You can do that with a battery energy storage solution, and you can say, hey, out of my 1,000 kW load, I want to shave off 100 kW, which I peak at some certain time. But upon loss of utility, you can't use a battery energy storage solution like a UPS, because a battery energy storage solution is grid following, not grid forming. And what that means is there is a time delay upon loss of power before that battery energy storage solution will kick in and provide you that battery backup. With a UPS system, there isn't a significant time delay, nothing that would interrupt your compute load. So you can't use a battery energy storage solution like a UPS solution. Now, you can use a combination of UPS and battery energy storage on your facility or your plant. So go to the next slide. So when we talk about peak shaving using lithium-ion batteries, the key is to have a software solution that's embedded that'll make the decisions for you. It's going to be looking at grid stability. It's going to be looking at when is the optimal time to do some peak shaving. When are you going to peak? On an August day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon is when we typically see that peak, and it's going to start throwing a portion of your load onto your UPS batteries versus relying 100% on your utility grid. Next slide. So what is peak shaving? We talked about that. Here you'll see this is an illustration on the left of a load graph. And in the morning, or in the evening hours, you may be low load. You don't have a solar load on the building. And in the afternoon, buildings will heat up, the cooling load will increase, and you'll see a peak demand. Now, in data center worlds, we don't see as great of a change in the load profile as we do in a commercial office building. A commercial office building is empty at night, and in the day, starting at 6, 7 in the morning, people start to funnel in, and then the sun comes up and starts beating down on it, and you'll see a dramatic rise from the evening hours to the peak daylight hours. But what I will say, in the data center world, what I expect to see is a change in the load profile to become more dramatic and more peaky. And what's driving that? It's the IT kit. The IT kit of yesterday was it's sitting there in the rack online with 0% CPU utilization. You may be consuming 55% of nameplate rated kW capacity. And as you start using that CPU utilization, it may go up to 65%, 70%. We rarely ever see 100% kW demand on that equipment. But the new servers today at idle, they are operating at 10% or less of the nameplate rating. So that what that means is when they start processing, you're going to see wider variations in the load on that IT kit. And so I think we're going to start seeing a lot more peaks up and down in the data center environment as those servers start cycling and processing. And it may be driven at different times of day, depending on the applications that are running in there. That represents opportunity to do a lot of micro peak shaving in a data center environment. Next slide. So how does it work? Here, you on the left, you have the utility grid that's coming into your facility. It's feeding your UPS systems, which are doing some power conditioning before it feeds the load. And you have these batteries tied to these UPSs. But with the right software and the right UPS, you can now utilize any excess capacity in those batteries to do some peak shaving. You can also expand the battery plant on the UPS so that you can get even greater peak shaving capability. Like I said, traditional UPS may be designed for 5, 10, 15 minutes of battery runtime, but there's nothing stopping you from adding another hour's worth of runtime capacity on those UPS systems, and now taking full advantage of it versus installing a separate independent battery energy storage solution. One of the benefits of utilizing UPS batteries is, when the batteries are sitting there and they're not being utilized, you don't know if they're good or bad. But by testing them on a regular basis and utilizing them to do peak shaving, now you can detect whether or not those batteries are good before backup is ever needed. So that's another side advantage that you get with utilizing a UPS with peak shaving capability. Next slide. So this is kind of illustrative of how it works. You don't have to switch 100% from the grid to the battery plant on the UPS. The software will control and you can preset how much peak shaving you want to do. So you may be pulling or supporting the load with 80% from the utility grid and 20% from your battery plant. And remember, this isn't full time. You're not operating in this mode, 24 hours a day. You're operating in this mode at the right times of day where you can shave that peak and reduce that kW demand charge on your utility bill. Next slide.
All right.
So this is an example, showing kind of a load profile in a building, and it looks very complex and confusing, but really it's very simple. What you're doing here is on the right third, you see kind of a yellow section there. That's the on-peak. Utility companies charge you. They have on-peak hours and off-peak hours, and the on-peak hours is when that kW demand charge is extremely high. And so that's typically, in the late afternoon hours, you're gonna see these peaks. You're gonna be on an on-peak demand charge, and that's when you're gonna go to a battery. Or you can go, in a microgrid solution, you may go to the battery on the UPS. It may be a battery energy storage solution. You may transfer to some other distributed energy resources like solar or a fuel cell or a wind turbine. There's all kinds of options there. And so you're shaving your peak, and then in the off-peak hours when the utility costs are low, that's when you can start recharging your batteries. And lithium-ion batteries, the great benefit of those is you can go from fully depleted to 100% charge in under 2 hours. So unlike a VRLA type battery solution, which may take you 10 to 12 hours to get back to full charge. So the introduction of lithium-ion batteries in the industry and the low cost of lithium-ion batteries now is really making this solution an option in the industry today. Next slide. Now I'll turn it back to Carson to talk about battery energy storage.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark. So I think many of us, we very well know that, Schneider Electric and APC, so we're very well known for the, UPS technology. Not many perhaps know that over the last 2 years, we also have developed a battery energy storage system, which is also taking advantage of lithium-ion batteries, as Mark just described. Now, I want to give you a brief overview. Before we go into the actually product itself, I want to highlight a few differences between what we call energy cells and power cells. When you look at the right-hand side, a power cell is typically what we see in a UPS. So number one, they're designed for typically short run times, and they have the ability to discharge themselves, of its entire capacity of energy in a very short period of time. So that's why we call them a power cell. And they're normally used for those UPS and, for emergency power backups. They are, in comparison to energy cells, lithium ion, about 1/3 higher in their cost, right? So a power cell, different lithium ion chemical composition, has a higher cost compared to energy cells. And then on the contrary, the energy cell, is capable of providing longer backup times. So we see like 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, so depending how the system is being configured. And as a result, it can release its energy it's stored over a longer period of time, not as fast as the power cell. And that's what's called the C rating. And we will see this here in a little bit when I go through this. Typically, those energy storage systems, the battery energy storage system with the energy cells, are used for peak shaving applications. And they're normally also being used in combinations with these intermittent renewable resources, specifically when we talk about wind and solar, because you imagine the wind's not always blowing or it's changing. The clouds may cover, solar panels, so therefore the energy production is not very consistent. But if I do have a consistent load, so now I can use a battery energy storage system and start discharging at certain times to make up that kind of required energy needed at a particular time. So when we look at our Schneider Electric offer, that is a fully integrated, very modular and scalable architecture. So these are NEMA 3 and 4 rated, so they can sit outside. And when we look at it, so they have all the battery management system inside in order to smartly charge and discharge the batteries. Has fully fire suppression inside, meets all the codes, the requirements right now. Has included, HVAC control, all the switch gear, the controller in terms of, a system need to be told when to charge and when to discharge. So that's part of how we interface with this smart energy controller. And then, all the power conversion systems are also included in there. And what you see here on this slide, it's basically the rear view on the right and the front view on the left. So these are the two cabinets. One is the electronics, and then multiple cabinets and the inverter, and then multiple cabinets of battery, depending on how big of a system we want. In our offer, we actually have 4 standard offers we provide, and they are called, we have a 125 kW. So the first line here, you see, that's the amount of energy the system is able to support at any given point in time. And then the nameplate energy, so these are the kilowatt hours, right? So we can now, in the 125 kW system, we can provide 125 kilowatts for the duration of 2 hours. So therefore, the total energy stored in there is 250 kilowatt hours. And then you see we can scale the system up to, 1 megawatt with a 2 megawatt hour worth of battery attached to it. So again, then we can provide 1 megawatt for 2 hours. And these lithium-ion batteries, as Mark was mentioning, so easily, 4,000 to 5,000 cycles. And then, they come in the different kind of voltages, typically here in the United States, 480 in and out, NEMA 3 rated, so they can sit outside. all the controls, the system is designed, from operating, when you consider outside environments, from minus 20 C, which, by the way, I'm not quite, although I was born in Europe, so I'm not quite sure what minus 20 C in Fahrenheit is, and 50 C Celsius. So you see all the different kind of things. So it meets the code, specifically UL 1741 and the supplement, which allows to stay online in a grid tight operation mode. And also UL 1547. So these are the new fire suppression codes. So, we've done all the testing on that, so they're fully compliant to those. Standard warranty, as I mentioned, and here you see the different kind of configuration and sizes. So if you're interested, we have, of course, more information available. So the challenging part now is, since we said, okay, we have all these capabilities of maybe self-generation and battery energy storage system, including the batteries attached to the UPS, So when do I charge? When do I discharge? How far do I discharge? So when you, for example, think about the UPS energy, as Mark mentioned, the batteries on the UPS, these are our insurance policies, right? So if we design the system for 10 minutes, that's the amount of backup time we want. I mean, if we do have backup generators, we may not need the full 10 minutes. But at the same time, if I were now to use our lithium-ion batteries attached to the UPS for some sort of peak demand shaving, I only want to use a certain amount of the energy, not all of it, because the reserve I have to maintain is actually for in case something really does happen to the utility power, and therefore I need my batteries now for the backup. So therefore we need a smart control. And then when we think about weather forecasting, if I do have a solar system and I may have wind and other resources, and I know how much fuel I have to, or how much I have to pay for fuel like natural gas if I have a gas turbine sitting there on site as well, or a fuel cell, I need to understand what's my price, what's my tariff of the utility company, what's my weather forecast, in terms of how much will I be able to generate myself today and tomorrow, and then make the smart decision, when do I charge, when do I discharge, how to financially optimize this. You can imagine this is a much more complex control algorithm right now. And the way we do this with our Microgrid Advisor, we have the analytics layer sitting in the cloud where we look at the constraints of the client and the ability to generate and produce and what our load is and what our load prediction is to make those smart choices. Then once we have a model which is supported by artificial intelligence to create this kind of optimized version, we take this information and we download it literally now to the client side where we have the microgrid operation, the EcoStruxure microgrid operation. And this model in the cloud gets updated every 15 minutes for the duration of 3 days. So we download an operational model of our microgrid on site every 15 minutes, which is then good for 3 days. So even if something were to happen and that the cloud service is not providing it, we still have an optimized forecasting model, which allows us to operate for the next 3 days. And then once an update is available, we send it down there. So therefore, we can really overcome those constraints, and we can reactively engage all of our distributed energy resources in this kind of microgrid and advanced microgrid operation. So Mark, let's talk about one of the microgrids we've installed at our own sites in Andover, just north of Boston.
Yes, thanks, Karsten. One of our first microgrid installations was actually in one of our facilities here in Boston, and want to walk through kind of the installation. In this picture here, you can see we have these carport areas that have solar power arrays mounted on top. So it provides shading to the cars, but it also gives the benefit of providing and generating solar power. There's also solar panels on top of the roof as part of this microgrid solution. Next slide. So in this solution, we created 375 kW of solar power through rooftop and the carports. The the building had an existing generator that was installed to back up a data center environment within this building. It was 400 kW, and then we later installed 125 kW of battery energy storage, which will be able to take that solar power when it's not being used to drive down carbon emissions or drive down the utility consumption, the grid utility consumption, to provide some energy storage and backup. Next slide. So here, this shows the initial state. And on the left, you can see a 400 kW generator. It was installed solely to support the data center, and the data center had less than 100 kW load. It was designed originally and anticipated to go to 400 kW, but that load never materialized. So in effect, what we've done is we've oversized the generator and we've stranded 300 kW of generator capacity in this solution that was solely dedicated to the data center. So in addition to the data center loads, you can see there are other essential loads in the building that are fed solely by the utility grid. And whenever we lost utility power, all of those other essential loads and other standard areas in the building would go down, and just the data center environment would be backed up. That impacted our personnel. They couldn't conduct business when the building was down and there was a loss of power. They lost power to their workstations. They lost power to the air conditioning. So it was very interruptive to the business. If you go to the next slide. So here we installed a microgrid solution, and you can see in the bottom right there's this energy control center, and Carson explained that. That's this control center that allows you to connect this other distributed energy resources, and it has this microgrid advisor software in there that'll make intelligent decisions as to when you should use these other distributed resources. So we had 375 kW of solar power tied to that, and then we also installed at a future date 125 kW of battery power. So between the generator, we had an excess of 300 kW of capacity on the left. So we tied off the output of the generator to feed this energy control center. So now if we lose utility power, we have the ability to back up these other services within the building outside of the data center environment with 300 kW of generator capacity. We have the solar and battery energy storage. It also gave us the ability to leverage this solar energy power and this battery energy storage to do some demand shaving, peak demand shaving in the building. And so we get a benefit of reduced utility consumption throughout the cycle. Next slide, please. So looking at from a summary, we used to have several outages a year. We were consuming 4.4 million kilowatt hours, $560,000 a year utility bill. After we installed the microgrid solution, now we are only consuming 3.8 million kWh off of the utility grid. We reduced our bill from $560,000 a year to $484,000 a year, just using the solar energy power and the battery energy storage solution. So we reduced our CO2 emissions by 457 pounds per year. So it's a great sustainability story. It's a great reliability story. It's a great cost reduction story. Next slide.
All right. Do you want me to talk to this, Mark, or you?
Go ahead.
All right. All right. So before we open it up for Q&A sessions, 2 more slides. So what does it all mean for us, right? So we have the ability to take advantage of this kind of new energy landscape, producing on-site, making smart decisions when to charge, discharge, when to buy from utility, to create actually like a financial incentive for ourselves. And then, another thing I want to mention we see on the right side here on the slide, the energy as a service. Mark just outlined our installation at our own facility in Andover, and we have many other customers who have done this as well, where yes, we have the savings and the utility bill. However, we as the company, we did not put out the capital expenditure to put all the carport solar, we have rooftop solar as well, the energy storage system. So this was done by an external company, and so we struck a power purchase agreement with them. So they paid for the entire installation, and we are basically the off-taker of it, and we have a monthly payment agreement with the provider. In terms of we have a fixed asset cost, we're saving money, we're more reliable, we're more resilient, and yet we did not bring the capital to bear in order to make this happen. Because when you think about these on-site generation assets, they are, have a return on investment, 8, 12, plus years. So therefore, it's not necessarily financial attractive from a corporation's perspective to shell out all the capital. However, we have partners, including our joint venture between the Carlyle Group and Schneider Electric called Alpha Structure, which is financing those kind of electro-intense projects. And this could include UPS upgrades, switchgear upgrades, the solar installations, batteries, and so forth. So there's many ways of how this financially can be executed. So last slide, and something for you to take away, what to consider. Number one, look at your resiliency, and are you okay with the way it is? Or are there areas of improvement where you can actually change things? Then I would suggest analyze your energy bill and identify your rate structures, engage your utility companies, and see what are my demand charges, and then understand the saving options. And we can help with this. And the last point in terms of helping with this is about doing a feasibility study, and we've done many of those. And there's a bit of the 6 to 8 cent rule. So if you pay less than 6 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour, it's probably not penciling out. There might be exceptions, of course, but if you pay more than 6 to 8 cents, financially at least it starts making sense. Determine your equipment life cycle, specifically when you think about your generators and UPS. So if there are considerations to change and to upgrade, may be able now to take advantage of all the things we talked about in terms of peak demand shaving, having lithium-ion batteries to your UPS, or perhaps a combination with battery energy storage system. So take advantage of this and understand, the corporate sustainability goals and the mandates from your organization and what your customers are expecting from you. So I think with that, concludes the part of the presentation, and we're going to open it now up for questions and answers.
Hey,
thanks.
Yeah, Carson. Yeah, this is Mark Hurley. I just want to add one thing while people are submitting questions to the chat. Carson mentioned we can help you. We have a microgrid competency center that can come in and do the analysis for you. They have software tools that'll look at what the return on investment is. Carson also mentioned that we have a partnership with the Carlyle Group and an entity called Alpha Structure that can also work with you and look at can they deploy the solution and operate and maintain that solution for no CapEx investment on your part. So those two things, we have two great entities that can come to bear and help you make the decision as what's the best solution to deploy for your specific case.
Yes, and programming note there, Mark, we have an innovation talk coming up featuring Alpha Structure on June 9th, so folks may be interested to join us then as well. So we've had quite a bit of questions come in through the chat, so we're going to start off with those, and given the fact that we only have 9 minutes left, we'll tackle what's in the chat and go from there. So first question for Mark and Karsten. When designing a microgrid for data centers, how long is the system designed to run off-grid?
Well, I assume I'm not muted. So that depends on the configuration of the system, right? So, I mean, we understand that normally we store fuel on site, typically diesel fuel, which gives us, I don't know, 24, 48, 72 hours, depending on the size of the tank. And that's a similar kind of question, So depending on the size of the tank, I will have X amount of hours or days to operate this. Now, in terms of energy storage systems, we typically don't necessarily talk about days, right? So therefore, it needs to be some sort of combination. However, if we don't have utility power available and the sun is still shining, so we're producing energy. So what happens is, if we have a microgrid with renewable on-site generation, we can actually limit or reduce the amount of fossil fuel stored on site and extend the backup time where we can operate independently from the utility because we're also generating at certain times.
Yeah, and I would add to that, typically, when you're thinking about a data center environment, you have generators that are designed to back up the whole environment, and it may, as Karsten mentioned, have 12, 24, 48, hours of runtime, and you just refuel those generators as needed, and you can run indefinitely off your generator plant. But that's never the intention. You're always relying on the grid for 90%, 98% of your runtime. But when it comes to other, components, distributed energy resources that make up your microgrid solution, those are really designed to give you more resiliency and to reduce your costs. So the size of that microgrid capability, those distributed energy resources, is really dependent upon an analysis you do of your load profile and the utility cost and what kind of incentives you might get from the states for, putting in sustainable solutions on your site and facility. It's typically designed to run for hours and shave your utility consumption from the grid.
Okay. Next question, can UPS plus lithium ion be used as peak shaving with old UPS equipment, or do you need to replace the old UPS to get all the benefits?
Yeah, so that's specific to a Schneider solution for newer UPS systems. It requires a software upgrade or a firmware upgrade so that it can interface with our Microgrid Advisor software solution and make intelligent decisions about when to go onto batteries to do some peak shaving capability. So it's not retroactive back to anybody's UPS system or older Schneider UPS systems.
To be very specific, right? So it's the Galaxy VM and the Galaxy VX currently, and somewhere in the future it will also be the Galaxy VS, the smaller one.
Okay, thanks, Karsten. Is cloud data accessible via API?
I assume that question relates to the the Microgrid Advisor software. The answer is yes. So we have standard APIs available in order to communicate to this, and specifically when you think about energy peak demand shaving, where aggregators, so perhaps we have an energy storage system attached to our UPS, and we are capable of, let's say, Mark explained where we take partial energy from the utility and partial from our batteries, to discharge them to support our load. This may in itself not be sufficient, to actually make it an attractive, long enough, powerful enough kind of event to participate in peak demand shaving. However, aggregators, energy aggregators, they are capable. I'll take from you the amount of energy you can give me. I'll take it from the neighbor and the other neighbor and the other neighbor. I aggregate this, and now I have a viable pool of energy, which now allows to create a financial incentive, and now I'm distributing the money saved or the generated to the people who participated. So the way we do this, we're writing to that API in order to kind of control that system, so to speak.
Okay. Next question for you two. Have you done analysis of using batteries for peak shaving versus loss of battery life and therefore greater cost of earlier battery replacement? Do you have any tools or spreadsheets that might assist with this?
So we have this, Carson. So we have done various analysis, and yeah. So first and foremost, yeah, even if you have a Galaxy VX or Galaxy VM right now, and you have VRLA batteries attached to it, I mean that would be absolutely not a way to go, right? Because if you now participate in peak demand shaving and you perhaps daily or weekly, start discharging batteries, it would so negatively impact your lifetime of your batteries that it would be cost prohibitive. So the financial savings would not be sufficient, to offset the replacement requirements for the batteries. On the lithium-ion batteries, on the other hand side, we have in our energy tool base, we have software where we can look into this, in terms of how many times can we charge and discharge, and then also it's not only about how frequently are we charging and discharging, but also how frequently do we deep discharge the batteries, right? So if we, for example, participate in peak demand shaving and we only start discharging, from let's say 100% storage to 80% over a longer period of time, so therefore it's not that fast, it's not that deep. So these are all relevant parameters to be considered, in terms of the life cycle of the batteries itself. So it's individual case by case.
Okay. And how do we handle security in regards to the cloud and our local network? Will this open up our systems up to the outside world?
No, it does not. I mean, that sounds like a broken record, right? So don't worry about cybersecurity. But the way we do this on a very high level, so the on-site controller actually sends a command to the cloud and says, like, I want your next version of forecast right now. And only then a port is being opened, in a secure way with the sockets and so forth to actually allow the download of the information. So we basically have a one-way street of communication. So that's how we ensure, including the additional kind of cybersecurity protocols, which are standardized in all of our EcoStruxure offers. So that there's, look, I wouldn't want to say there's never be a compromise, because, I mean, everybody, it's like the more sophisticated your alarm system is, the more sophisticated the thieves become, right? So it's a constant way of doing this. So, but we have the most cyber secure system in place given the current circumstances.
Excellent. Thanks, Carson. We appreciate your expertise and transparency there. And we have come to the end of the hour here, and I want to be mindful of everybody's schedules and time. So if there are questions that you submitted we didn't get to, we will follow up with you directly. And I want to thank everyone for your questions. This was certainly a very engaged topic, so we appreciate it. And I did put a link in the chat so that you can see what topics are coming up over the next few weeks for Innovation Talk series on Tuesdays. And we also have an Innovation Live series that we host on Thursdays, and those take place at our Innovation Executive Briefing Center in St. Louis. And it's more of a walking through a live demo of some of our different offers and solutions. And I just dropped that link in the chat too if you're interested in checking those out. So without further ado, Mark and Carsten, thanks for your time today, your subject matter expertise, and sharing all this information. And thank you to all of our guests for taking time out of your day to spend with us and learn more about microgrids and battery energy storage. And we hope everyone has a good rest of your Cinco de Mayo and week. Stay safe, be well, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here next week. Thanks again and take care.
Thank you. And that concludes today's conference. Thank you all for participating. You may now disconnect.
Are we still staying online?